All right, this next topic is literally brought to you by popular demand. That is to say, in last year's student critiques of the ethics conferences, we asked them topics they would like to hear addressed, and this was one that came out rather prominently in the surveys as something that we hadn't done, and honestly I hadn't thought much about. Subsequently, we had a conference on Libya last fall, and the NATO commander, who was a Canadian general, spoke about the operations in Libya. And one of the themes he hit very hard was the value of social media in an operational context, which I'd never thought about. The example that he gave was they were trying to drop old-style leaflet bombs to give information to the population, and most of the bombs turned out to be duds, and they weren't working very well. And it dawned on them, why aren't we just sending text messages to as many phone numbers as we can find in Libya? And when they went to that method, they were much more effective at disseminating information. So that's only one of many areas that I think Admiral Smith will take us through. So let me give my formal introduction. As evidenced in the last few years, the rise of social media is not only transforming the political landscape of the U.S., it also affects the military profession and the nation's military. We've already seen that question arise on a number of occasions in the conference so far. The question for each of you in uniform today is, how will it affect your leadership, your commands, your service, and your missions? To help us frame our thoughts on this important topic, Rear Admiral Greg Smith, U.S. Navy retired, joins us. A native of Dubuque, Iowa, Rear Admiral Smith was commissioned in 1982 after receiving a Bachelor of Arts from the University of Iowa. He was a 1997 honors graduate of Old Dominion University, receiving a master's degree in public administration. Before his recent retirement, Rear Admiral Smith was a career Navy public affairs officer, responsible for all communication activities in the Afghanistan theater, including public affairs, military information support operations, and traditional communication. Previously, he was a director of communication for United States Central Command during a period of critical counterinsurgency operations, partnership building, and humanitarian assistance across 20 nations. From 2007 to 2008, he served as principal spokesman and chief of public affairs for Multinational Force Iraq during the war's pivotal surge. Rear Admiral Smith was the U.S. Navy's chief of information from 2006 to 2007, managing the Navy's public affairs community and serving as the principal spokesman for the Department of the Navy and Strategic Communication Council to the Secretary of the Navy and the CNO. He received numerous assignments ashore, afloat, and overseas during his 30-year career. Please join me in welcoming Rear Admiral Smith as he comes to speak on the topic, Social Media and Warfare, Tool or Hindrance. Admiral Smith.
I like to start in the back of the room because it gives me an opportunity to sort of assess where I'm going to go and how you'll see me in the front, and also a chance to wake up the back row. So, it's also a way to sort of, I think, demystify or break down some of the stereotypes and the biases that I don't think people necessarily in this room might have, but as I've talked to civilian audiences, not on this topic, but others, you realize that they're looking at somebody that they think they know, a Navy flag officer, but they really don't. And I also found that, by the way, to be the case when you went looking for a job. So I'm glad to be here. This is not a place that I came as a student. I came here several times on the coat heels of several admirals and generals over the years came to speak at this War College and many others, but they never had the privilege, really, of spending the year of time to commit to understanding our national security issues in the way you're all doing. It was a nice introduction by Dr. Cook, and I appreciate that, and it sort of set the stage for perhaps why I would be up here talking about this topic. But I did, because of this audience in particular, I wanted to sort of tell a quick story, a bit of a sea story about how those last 4 or 5 years sort of transgressed, I guess you could use the term, in a way that I didn't predict. And maybe it's also a bit of enlightenment for anyone in this room who thinks they know where they're going in their career. Does anybody think they know where they're going to go after in the next, say, 15 years of your career? I doubt it. But you also maybe have a sense of some limitations to what you could do within your particular area of expertise. Again, I was really shocked to think that after seeing my future come to sort of it's the top of the game, if you will, being the CHINFO in Washington in 2006, would I end up serving in 2 different combat theaters? And the way that happened was we had a very enlightened Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Mike Mullen, who had come back in I guess it was Christmas of 2006, from the Middle East visiting sailors. He was in the theater, obviously had gone into Baghdad at the time, and came back very disappointed at what he was seeing not only on the ground in terms of the structure and the emphasis, but also what he also knew going into it as a very lackluster communication effort about what was happening inside Iraq. And that was not only lackluster, again, within the force understanding it, within the greater national community that was involved, the enemy, the people of Iraq, but as well people of the United States and the rest of the world. And he came to my office, and I came to his office, obviously, but I came to him and he said, Greg, I need you to think about putting together a team to go support this new guy heading over there, is Dave Petraeus. Well, I think I'd seen General Petraeus once in the Pentagon. I didn't know him. Didn't think much of that issue per se at the time. Later we learned that would be a significant mistake, not recognizing his power and potential as a leader at that moment. But as I went into it, I thought, well, I'm just going to go over there. I'm just going to do my thing and support this commander in the field with my assessment. So we went over in the spring of 2007 for what was going to be a 3-week assessment trip. Got on the ground. I don't think it was within an hour or two, I was advised that General Petraeus welcomes you aboard, but he has no intention of letting you go in 3 weeks. If you're going to come here to assess, he's tired of all the assessment teams. He needs you to stick around for a little while to help put some things into motion. So whatever you come up with, you're buying into it. Well, I didn't know how long that meant, but the long story short is it ended up being another year. I didn't go back to the Pentagon. We put together a series of recommendations that would assist really across the public affairs dimension. And I served then as the head of communications in Iraq through the spring of 2008. I came back, again, thinking I knew I'd have a year to go in as a flag, because in the public affairs community, we top out at 1 star. We do our 3 years, the next person comes along and serves. So I knew I had 1 more year left in uniform, I thought. I was within days of heading into the Pentagon, literally a Friday. We already had our house in Washington, D.C., in military quarters up near the Navy Annex, probably the sweetest deal I'd ever gotten in terms of associated with the Pentagon tours, which I had 5, living literally a bicycle right away. When I got a call saying, do not go in the office on Monday morning. You're going down to Tampa. Petraeus wants you to go there. He's going to be following you a few months later. So we literally stopped any movement towards the house, drove the car down to Tampa, and reported to work the following week. Spent the next year, again, thinking this is my last year, working on really what we'd learned in Iraq, but putting it in more of a theater context. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. After a year or so, I had thought I'd made some good progress, but again, my sights were on, let's go, I'm going to retire, I'm going to transition to civilian life. I've had my 26 years at that point of fun, it's time to move on. When literally a week before retirement, I was out of the house, we were packed up, we were ready to head back up north to Virginia. I already got my business card, set up my little consulting firm I was going to do. I was really thinking transition when I got a call from the chairman at home one night. And he goes, Greg, I don't know if you saw the news today, and I actually had not, but the president has hired this new guy to take over in Afghanistan, Stanley McChrystal. I knew the name, I more than knew the name, I knew him quite well from Iraq. He served as the commander of special forces in Iraq. And I knew it was coming. He said, Greg, this is really not a conversation in terms of this is going to be pretty much one way, but we need you to go to Afghanistan. So we're going to cancel your retirement. And, oh, by the way, you got to leave on Friday. So for those of you that have spouses or families, you can just imagine the trauma that set in motion. But also just, mentally, I wasn't prepared for this transition, but we had to quickly nor I think with General McChrystal for that matter, because the changes in Afghanistan, if you recall at that time, happened really quick. Anyway, we went off to Afghanistan. About 8 months into what I would think would be your normal sort of 1-year deployment to the theater, we got a call again from this time. Well, actually, General McChrystal came out of BTC with the Secretary of Defense and the chairman, and then General Petraeus down CENTCOM, and he looked over at me and said, Greg, stand by for a phone call from the chairman. And I went, you just sort of knew, or I at least knew at that point, that this wasn't going to be a good conversation. He called, so he said, Greg, what you've been doing in Afghanistan, we all know, has made a difference. We need you to stay, so you're not going home. And I said, well, I hope this is an order, because there's no way I'm going to call my wife and say I'm staying another year in Afghanistan. He goes, it's an order. So at that point, I knew I had committed myself to 2 years in Afghanistan, and at that point, we had a lot of work to do. So I was focused and moving forward. Of course, right after that is when General McChrystal got fired. I've heard some discussion here this morning earlier, and we certainly could talk about the backstory on that one in a little more detail. Then who comes up? But General Petraeus shows back up as my commander in Afghanistan, spent the 2nd year there. Left spring of 2009, and did I get that right? Yeah, 2011 rather. Spring of 2011, after 2 years. And then began the real transition. And happily, and I'll share this with you as well, don't take anything for granted, because as you know, to retire as a 2-star normal rank, you retire after 3 years of service. There are waivers, but they aren't guaranteed by any stretch. In fact, mine was denied at first. And I would have to serve a second in my last year somewhere. So I asked for a little consideration, and I got that consideration, and I was able to retire. So I left the service last year of October, and started a little consulting firm, moved to Tampa, started working the golf game, figured out how to be a dad and a husband all over again, and enjoying life. But I'm really happy to be here to talk and sort of re-engage and get my juices flowing again about this subject, because to be honest with you, down in Tampa, and perhaps like most parts of the country, we've gone off the net when it comes to this subject of warfare and the things we're going to associate with Iraq and Afghanistan. So it'd be fun to sort of re-engage on those topics. So let me go up on the stage. I'm going to use a few notes to cheat from. And I promise we'll get through this, and then really the goal of the day is not for me to get through my remarks, but more importantly for us to have an opportunity to talk about what you want to talk about. I know the last session involved a number of topics that I would be loved to debate on, so if you want to bring it back up again, go for it. And if not, we'll stick to the social media content and go from there. In my personal life, I am not a social media junkie by any stretch. I do have a Facebook page, but I'm never on it. I do have a Twitter account, but I've actually never used it. Occasionally I have watched YouTube videos when my kids send me something interesting. And I have a LinkedIn profile. So from a personal point of view, I'm not immersed in social media like I'm certain many people in this room are. That's something that said earlier, maybe a generational issue. I understand it from a professional point of view in a real intimate way, and that's what I hope to be able to share with you based on my experience working in it from a warfare perspective. So I know there'll be discussion about social media today that have nothing to do with warfare, have something to do with marketing or branding or advertising, or where our kids going these days, nobody's communicating to each other. We can have those discussions if you want, but that's not my forte. Mine is in the military domain, and happy to talk about it. But let's go to slide 2, please, and we'll define what we mean by social media. And it is truly an interactive platform. Social media, by its nature, allows users to generate content and interact. That's the key to social media. Now, we've had many forums that would allow this to occur, just not from a technical point of view. But social media has become a medium, a forum for that. And the second definition, that I'll share in a second, sort of gets to that. But here are some of the obvious ways in which we use social media, social bookmarking among them. And what we've also described this as a form of really a web-based, internet-based applications that build upon the foundation of Web 2.0 and allow the creation and exchange of user-generated content again. So we can tag and bookmark on websites. We obviously have websites that allow people to vote and comment on articles, you see there. There are forums that you all are really familiar with that link friends and create profiles. Another is websites that share videos and, of course, images. Probably the most powerful, I think, of all the mediums is just that forum to push video and still photography. And then there are others that allow you to sort of add information, content, the wiki piece we talked about earlier. But ultimately, social media is any software, any social software that mediates or facilitates the human communication. That's all it really is. It's not that complex, but it obviously has become a very complex subject when you think about dealing with it. Not on this slide is Twitter, and Twitter is the most powerful, most rapidly growing of all the forms of social media. And it's the one in which I'll spend time talking about from the context of Egypt and Tunisia in particular, and those particular revolts. Slide 3, please. So there are characteristics of social media that I think you really have to embrace as a military commander to understand it. When we speak about what we can do in that domain, in terms of a government or as a military, we need to understand these characteristics. It's critical that we understand it because if we're going to consider a role for government to play in respect to social media, whether we're talking about monitoring, participating in it directly, or at the other end of the kinetic spectrum, denial of social media services, We will be somewhat limited in discussing the latter, though, because when we talk about denial of service, we certainly have the capacity from a technical point of view, but we often lack a political will in some cases, a policy, or a legal authorities to do so. So there's two factors for accessibility, and these include low barriers to entry. Social media accessibility is free of charge. It's free of charge licenses and affiliations. It is granted to everyone. Free access to social media has democratized influence and control. Democratized influence and control. Social media is widely accessible, uncontrolled media. It takes away the power of government and other institutions of communication and influence and puts it back in the hands of people. The barriers to entry are almost non-existent. And they require virtually no real technical expertise as a user to participate in that forum. The second factor of accessibility is low communication barriers. Social media has been useful in breaking the communication barriers that hinder transmission of the message. Since online interaction requires no interpersonal skills, the number of people socializing online has exploded, as statistics we'll discuss later will show. Communication becomes easier by transcending many codes of behavior. One can approach a complete stranger. He or she can discuss private issues with much less hesitation, disclosing even the most private of secrets. Online users can engage in the hottest of debates assertively to defend their views, which many cannot do in the real world offline. With a few clicks, they can cross out whomever they don't like. With less interaction barriers, they can become very communicative in expressing their outlook, even attract supporters, as we'll see later in Tunisia and Egypt. As Helen Farrar, head of internal communications at Virgin Media, said recently, social media is moving water cooler conversations into the public arena, making it easier to understand people's messages and emotions. So just how prevalent is social media? The next couple of slides we'll go into that, and we'll sample just a small piece of the statistics. Again, I did not include all the marketing and the business side of social media. There's a lot of statistics on that. This is more focused on areas that affect you as military commanders. Slide 4, please. There are, again, a host of statistics, and I thought these were pretty interesting. What jumps out at me is the just enormous scale of the internet. It's a platform that hosts this conversation, this social media domain, and the number of people around the world with access and who have made internet and social media part of their daily lives, to me, is staggering. It's a transition that has happened relatively overnight, and it really affects how we think about communications. Over 2 billion people online, 2 billion people. 52 million blogs and 8 million pages. Every minute we tweet 100,000 times. We search Google 2 million times, and we create astounding nearly 600 new websites every single minute. 600 new websites every single minute. Consider this other fact. The New York Times reported that a market research firm estimated that 30 years ago, an average person was exposed to about 2,000 messages a day, compared to about 5,000 in 2007. So it took nearly 30 years to double. But yet in the last 5 years, it's more than doubled again to over 10,000 messages a day. That means that every day we're bombarded with 10,000 messages which we must assimilate into our lives and sort out the truth and figure out what matters to us and our families. Slide 5, please. In this slide, I've highlighted 2 of the more compelling social media sites, Facebook and Twitter. I'll let you read these for yourself, but the statistics, again, are impressive, and we'll discuss later, can be a daunting task when you consider just these 2 forums from a military commander's perspective. Arab countries are not the leading sector of demographically for which you'll see presence of social media, yet it has become the way in which the young in particular are having their voices heard, and of course we're going to talk about that. But from a purely statistical point of view, obviously social media is more embraced by nations with affluency, education, and access to technology. Slide 6, please. Oh, you're good. So just how much planning and operational resources and personal bandwidth do you as military commanders, and how much that should you spend on social media? Here are a few scenarios to consider. First of all, should a commander spend time considering the impact of social media as used privately within the ranks? Should we care about whether or not our people use social media? As we've discussed, the use of social media has exploded by the general population, and of course our people are a microcosm of society. Should the military specifically regulate the use of social media by the force through policies and procedures? Or conversely, have we already done that in other ways? Should we prescribe an ethos across the force for use of social media, both in their personal and professional life? Just how much impact, both positive and negative, does social media have on our mission? Is this an OPSEC issue, or is this simply a public affairs issue? A second scenario, should a commander be concerned about the use of social media by the U.S. public as a form to comment and often criticize military operations and matters of national security? This is clearly a very sensitive issue and one that needs to be carefully considered. Public opinion, no matter what form it's carried, needs to be well understood by military commanders, but there is an expectation of right of free speech inherent in the use of social media, so clear boundaries need to be set. A third scenario considers, for example, the use of social media by disenfranchised, angry young, underemployed Muslim males as a means to garner support for their causes and as a form to call for action against our national security interest. Does the post-9/11 world make this commander's business? What is the appropriate level of commitment of operational and intelligence resources in addressing this dynamic of social media? What are the ethical ramifications of governments monitoring, interfering, injecting, or denying social service access in the case of this scenario? And finally, the last scenario, and there are perhaps many more. What about the use of social media by our declared enemies, both state and non-state actors? This scenario poses a much more complex issue than most would prescribe. Social media lives on the internet, and the actions governments can and should take need to be carefully considered. There are a challenging set of conditions for the military commanders to work through, not the least of which is the role played by and the authorities of the various U.S. agencies involved directly or indirectly in social media. And we'll discuss that more if you'd like. Given the limited time we have today, I will focus on the latter two scenarios, young, angry Muslim males and the enemy. However, if the use of social media by our forces or by the general public is of interest, we certainly can cover that during Q&A. Since September 11, 2001, we have been in the middle of two highly contested, dangerous, unpredictable, and relentless wars, hunting down terrorists who operate across the Middle East and North Africa. We've also been witness to events that surprised many with the awakening of the Arab Street, many of the disenfranchised young males I mentioned and just talked about, who are demanding social change. Some have called the recent uprisings in Tunisia and Egypt the Facebook and Twitter revolutions. A Cairo activist who participated in the Egyptian revolt said this when asked about the role of social media. We used Facebook to schedule the protest, Twitter to coordinate, and YouTube to tell the world. A very intriguing comment. Again, the activists used Facebook to schedule their protesters, Twitter to assist in coordinating a disparate group of citizens, and they relied on YouTube to tell the world of their plight with the Egyptian government through video and pictures. An editorial in the New York Times concluded that Facebook and Twitter helped people in organizing and coordinating protests by cross-communicating and spreading information. A perhaps more humorous reference to social media was observed in a Jordanian newspaper regarding the Tunisian revolt. It said, "Why do the Tunisian youth demonstrate in the streets? Don't they have Facebook?" In its annual analysis of world human rights, Amnesty International praised the role of websites such as Twitter and Facebook in igniting the biggest revolt against the oppressive regimes since the end of the Cold War. You may not immediately recognize the name Wael Yonem, who Time magazine ranked the most influential personality of 2011. Does anybody know who he is? I'll probably pronounce his name in a terrible way. But he was the Egyptian-born Google executive who was really turned into the iconic social media figure and in part helped mastermind the Egyptian revolution. He started a group on Facebook, We Are All Khalid Saheed, in memory of an Egyptian who was brutally killed by the Egyptian police. Using his Facebook page, he helped in organizing protests and motivating the youth to continue protesting against the government. He was a marketer who branded the revolution and convinced people to trust him. There is clear evidence that social media accelerated the Egyptian revolution, which was sparked by the earlier events in Tunisia. But it's equally important to stress that social media acted as a tool for the protesters and was not the sole basis for the revolution. Even though the triggers of the revolution were numerous, social media played a very important part in uniting the youth of Egypt and helped them in organizing and coordinating the protests against their government. Social media was a crucial tool in building the Egyptian movement and was connected to the emergence of the new tech-savvy generation of Muslim Brotherhood. The Egyptian protesters include a vast number of internet-savvy Twitter and Facebook users who coordinated the movement. There were documented limits to the role social media played in the Arab uprisings, especially when governments began to shut down the internet. But most would agree that by the time those governments took direct action, social media had allowed organizers to put into motion their agenda for civil change, and government actions are reported to only have emboldened the actions of members more aggressively. The events in Egypt and Tunisia have provided ample data, and researchers have broken the use of social media into several categories. One was to raise awareness. One was to sway and ultimately coalesce opinion, as we've discussed, and of course to organize for action. But also it was used as a way to report real-time on events. And what's interesting in that perspective is the role in which mainstream media were fed information through those sources. And of course, in the end, it was to direct the actions of others. Perhaps more recognizable military jargon would have said that the social media used in Egypt was used as an information or psychological operations to influence and change behavior, or as well as to facilitate the command and control of operations. The fundamental aspect of what's happened in the Middle East, to include Iraq and Afghanistan, has been about changing the conditions of individuals living under oppressive regimes, whose governments have had near complete control over them, limiting, if not outright restricting, many forms of information and communication. Those conditions are directly at odds with the opportunity brought about by the evolution of the internet and the use of social media as a medium to raise the conversation to a wider world audience and as a call for action. To my mind, there's never been a medium as flexible, available, or powerful as social media in successfully bringing about rapid change in civil society. So let's dive into some of the data in Tunisia and Egypt and look for how that may relate back to our thinking about future conflicts. Next slide, please. Facebook is the most popular social media network in the Middle East and has nearly 9 million users in Egypt. 78% of Egypt's Facebook users are between 15 and 29 years of age, and 22% of those are above the age 30, making them one of the youngest Facebook and social media audiences inside the Middle East. In a recent survey, as I mentioned earlier, about the effects of government shutting down the sites and only emboldening the cause, 6 of 10 reported that to be their feelings. According to the Egyptian Ministry of Communication, 70 million Egyptians own a mobile phone, constituting more than 87% of the population, and provided them easier access to the internet and social media websites. You can see the Twitter usage in Egypt during that same time frame was over 1 million. Not a high number, but considering those that were on the sites. And the next slide demonstrates, I'm sorry, go back one. The most popular trending hashtag across Arab regions during that period were those that had hashtag Egypt, hashtag January 25th, which was the start. Libya began to get traction with its own, Bahrain, and then another one just generically, hashtag protest. So the use of hashtags became the forum, obviously, as you all are well aware in the Twitter world, to begin to use that cross-communication to spread the word through a collective medium inside Twitter. According to one government official in Egypt, Twitter usage more than doubled since the uprising in Egypt, which I think begins to put in perspective just what role Twitter and other social media forums will play in the Middle East in the future. While revolutions occurred long before Twitter, it is now prominent that political phenomena can be accelerated by social media. These effects require reflection on the similarities of both the 2004 Kiev and the 2011 Cairo protests, and how technology and social media played a part in them. In both countries, manifestations seem to break out of nowhere, mainly led by well-educated yet anonymous youth. Technology certainly played a role in both. Back in 2004, however, Twitter was not available, but the internet and mobile phones were major players. In Egypt, social media threatened the regime that reacted by blocking internet and social media. And again, many workarounds were made through technology innovation. For any mass movement to take place, a space for communication is needed. A few decades ago, this used to happen in bookshops and underground newspaper offices. Today, online spaces have added to the regular ones on the ground. According to one Egyptian activist in Tahrir Square, online meetings replaced the secret ones that could have been broken up by the police. It was just that much safer. The Tunisia and Egypt uprisings have clearly opened up the debate on the role of social media and its effect on movements within nations, especially in the context of similar uprisings that predated social media's dominance. But it has been the use of social media by terrorist groups, such as Al-Qaeda, that have served as the most direct threat to our national interest. And I'll focus on that now. Slide 8, please. Next slide. I'm sorry, back one. The internet, more specifically social media, has been a boon to Al-Qaeda and other transnational terrorist groups. He used it as a means to bypass traditional forms of communication and focus their energy on jihadist websites and other social media forums to reach worldwide audiences of would-be terrorists. I turned my attention to this particular subject when I was at CENTCOM and focused on a theater-wide communication effort to address it. We began to explore the thorny and convoluted world of Al-Qaeda's use of the internet by trying to answer a series of questions. First, how complex was Al-Qaeda's command and control of their internet efforts? Who and where were they authoring the large amounts of written content we were seeing? Where were the images and videos coming from, and how were they being produced? Who uploaded and who approved and uploaded that content to the internet? And perhaps the most troubling issue, in what nations were Al-Qaeda websites being knowingly or unknowingly hosted? Here's what we learned. Command and control of the internet rested within a hierarchical set of Al-Qaeda leaders charged with their global communication efforts. The actual number of Al-Qaeda making strategic communication decisions was very limited. Similarly, a limited number of highly educated, often in Western schools and who spoke good English, were charged with producing that written content. Keep in mind, much of the rhetoric on jihadist websites is based on their twisted ideology of Islam. Like the madrasas in Pakistan that turn out hundreds of young terrorists, these men were skilled at communicating a language that resonated with both the uneducated and educated youth, many of whom were searching for answers to their plight and distrust of the West by communicating in a faith-based language. Events were being created by terrorists solely for their visual impact and propaganda use. Something we first saw in Iraq, but really came into focus for me in Afghanistan, was that very few high-profile attacks were ever conducted without careful consideration of how they would capture that on video and stills. In fact, you could argue that some events did not occur operationally because those factors were not in place at the right time. And then how would they move that content rapidly to locations where they could assimilate, edit, and distribute? The actual approval process of any single posting often rested with one or two individuals, which made the process of delivering high volumes of content that more difficult for Al-Qaeda, but was seen as a necessary step to ensure both the consistency of message and a focused message being disseminated in time and space at the correct moment they wanted it to be. In Iraq, we raided several nondescript mud facilities in the middle of literally nowhere, only to find a very sophisticated, high-volume photo and video editing facility. Al-Qaeda used a similar process in Afghanistan, although they moved those facilities into Pakistan, making it much more difficult. To address some of these challenges, I set up a jihadist website monitoring and engagement team in Tampa. This was the first of its kind in the Department of Defense and was built around other, although dissimilar, efforts at State and CIA. We hired about a dozen linguists and native speakers, primarily Arabic. Oddly enough, many Iraqis in particular live in the Midwest. Many of those individuals are in their 50s and 60s, lived through some of the tougher times and have spent the last decade or two here in the United States and are certainly proud citizens of both America and their homeland, and volunteered readily to support us. What I asked them to do was look at the most prolific of the Al-Qaeda's websites and begin to look for opportunities to directly engage in the conversation. I knew we had a steep hill to climb, but if we hoped to influence Al-Qaeda's narrative, we had to participate in the forums they were communicating in, and we had to do it in real time. We had to understand the nuanced and Islamic-laced narrative that Al-Qaeda was using. We also had to understand how the young men who participated in these jihadist websites thought about Al-Qaeda and the West. What did and did not resonate with them? How could we enter into a conversation without immediately alienating the reader by appearing too Western, or worse, a U.S. government puppet? The objective was not to necessarily interrupt the flow of information or communication from Al-Qaeda to its followers, but to offer a more balanced narrative. The litmus test for our team was to identify whether Al-Qaeda's narrative was accurate, was in context and proper characterization. We had to comprehend all of this and respond in both a manner and speed appropriate for this specific website. A chat room conversation on a jihadist website wasn't going to wait around for a bureaucratic, lethargic, lumbering approach on our part. It took us months to gain the acuity and agility I was looking for, but once we worked through a series of protocols for how and when our team would engage, we turned them loose. And by the time I left for Afghanistan in the spring of 2009, we were beginning to see signs of making a difference, albeit small given the broad scope of al-Qaeda's impact on the internet. Once in Afghanistan, I put together a much more comprehensive and bolder communication effort, building what we learned in Iraq and CENTCOM. There isn't ample time to go into all the details of how we organized for that effort, but what we became in my organization was a single node for all communication efforts across Afghanistan for both the US and NATO. Unlike Iraq, where there was no single connection for the commander, in this case General Petraeus, General Crystal, as I started in Afghanistan, to focus his operational planning, his intelligence requirements towards our communication efforts. And we achieved that by unifying those various areas of public affairs and information operations. We could collectively assess, analyze, plan, and act in a harmonious and synchronized manner. Intelligence, as well as operational acuity, were the cornerstones of how we approached every form of communication with the public and the enemy. A carefully crafted narrative that was often initially rolled out in one of my press briefs would later show up on the streets of Kandahar, the very same message in in the dialect and in the narrative that made sense to the local people, but very much the same message. And that was delivered, of course, by our PSYOP teams. But to focus on the second of our two social media scenarios, it was our approach to al-Qaeda's use of the internet that I found the most challenging, both in working the interagency piece, as well as understanding how best to counter their efforts in tangible ways. As to the interagency, there is a raging debate between the intelligence and operational communities on the value of allowing nodes of an enemy's communication network to remain viable. A command and control example would be a shortwave antenna that the Taliban had strung across the mountaintops in southern Afghanistan to support their command and control of its forces. This served as both a rich data mining node or nodes for our intelligence community, but is also seen by our operational forces as a true risk to our forces. Again, due to classification, I won't be able to share too much about what we did to actually address that issue. But for at least one commander, I'll let you guess who that was. He was nearly always convinced that the right answer was to destroy the communication node, vice leaving it open for an intelligence channel. The same argument plagued us in the social media domain as well. The intel community, and I'm referring really here to the broader interagency intelligence community outside DoD, although certainly voices within inside DoD felt the same, fought virtually every effort we made to shut down an al-Qaeda website, no matter where it was located. And I'll go into that in a second. I'm certainly not criticizing their logic per se. Again, I get the piece about intelligence gathering. And they also had they had the history of our previous efforts, although somewhat lame, were easily worked around by al-Qaeda. As you know, in the internet, there's really no single path. There's an infinite number of ways which a tech-savvy internet organization within al-Qaeda could generate that same amount of content through another path. The moment we shut down one, they start another. It became certainly a cat and mouse game, and we were the cat and they were the mouse, and we often lost in that step. They were up very quickly back on the net, usually within days. Now, what may surprise you, though, and to be honest with you, I was really shocked when I first learned this. When we started really digging into al-Qaeda's use of the internet, we had to understand a lot of technology or technical pieces to it. And one, of course, was what was the pathway of information moving to the end users. And what we found was, in the case, this is 2009, 2011 timeframe, that at least a half a dozen prominent al-Qaeda websites had ISP hosts right here in the United States. They were legitimate ISP providers, presumably, and I think in most cases they were, who ran a large ISP business in Houston, Texas, for which, unbeknownst, I suspect to them, among all the many various 600 blogs that are created every day and websites, they in fact were hosting a named enemy, the al-Qaeda. Now, what was also frustrating was the fact that we could do very little about that from a government point of view. I had a vehicle available to me. It was a formal letter of request to the Justice Department to seek an injunction on their part to shut down websites that were fit that characterization. But unfortunately, the Justice Department, and I'm sure there's lawyers here in the room who can make similar arguments, felt that we would be overstepping our bounds in many ways, to include free speech, if in fact the government began to intercede in that particular area. So in the end, to my knowledge, during the time frame I was there, we never, as a government, addressed this issue. Now, interestingly, there was a gentleman who lived in the mountains of, I think it was Montana, who it was his goal in life to see that every one of these websites got shut down. And he existed long before I ever came around. And we learned about him. And it was at watching his technique, he used social media to beat social media. And he would blog, he would write letters, he would do everything he could to include contacting the organization themselves. And in most cases, he was successful in getting them shut down. Just obviously these organizations, again, ISP provider in Houston, Texas, last thing they want to be known as is a supporter of Al-Qaeda. But as a government, we were handcuffed. And that's a pretty oversimplified example, but it does demonstrate the limits to government in this particular area. I'll end this, let me just, I'll just wrap this up and we'll get to Q&A, which is always the fun part of these things. Let me just leave a few observations for you. And there's so much we could talk about inside baseball in terms of Afghanistan and Iraq, and I hope we get into some of it. But let me just leave you a few observations. Unquestionably, social media has changed how people communicate. There's just no doubt about it. Again, in my generation, I'll go out with my wife to dinner and sit, and I'll recall just not recently, all too recently, an event in which I saw a group of 25, 30-somethings, about 6 or 8 of them at a table, and not a single one of them were talking to each other. Every one of them had their phone, and they were maybe even talking to somebody across the table for all I know. But they were carrying on a conversation that was divorced of sort of the traditional way in which we saw conversation occurring, my generation anyway, at a dinner conversation at a nice restaurant. But it has changed the way we communicate. It is here to stay, and so we need to understand that. It has shifted the access of power away from governments and traditional communication institutions, such as the news media, and placed that power back in the hands of people. And it's the average citizen around the world who has embraced this new medium. It's a global phenomenon. Wealth, education, religion, ethnicity are without consideration when it comes to social media. Inside Afghanistan, it was clear that the value of a cell phone outweighed nearly every other aspect of life for some members of Afghan society. There was one young boy who literally gave up the only thing he owned, which was a donkey-drawn donkey-drawn cart. And it was the means by which he would move his trade craft, whatever that was, around the villages. He traded all that in so he could get a cell phone, because then he knew he could really reach out to somebody beyond his village. So the young, although uneducated, could see the power of the medium of the internet, and also the voices through social media. Governments are clearly struggling to define what role we need to play or should play within social media. And hopefully we can talk about that in a little bit in the Q&A. But it is a part of modern warfare. It's both the role of intelligence as well as our operational planning, but there are limitations to both, as we discussed earlier. Finally, social media can be seen as a constructive tool in our modern warfare toolkit, while at the same time frustrating and even compromising our military goals and objectives. Instead of ignoring the role of social media and what it can play in both social and political movements, some of which may involve eventually use of military force to deal with, the focus should be on how to use social media to its best advantage. So with that, let's talk about this subject and any other one you want. Again, the discussion that preceded me involved many topics that I'd be happy to jump in on as well. So back to you.